It's the NUFC Monday Show, and on this week's episode we're going to be looking at a really interesting transfer link with a Euro 2024 superstar, and Eddie Howe's future is under the microscope. Hello and welcome back to the NUFC Monday Show. I hope you're not too disheartened by the disappointment of England's defeat in the Euro 2024 final last night. I did a reaction to that game on my YouTube channel, so if you want to check that out, it's on the channel now. I'll link it in the description as well. The final episode of the Euros Daily Debrief. But we are here to talk about Newcastle United. We are here to hopefully move on from international football. The Premier League is now the main focus. It's nearly here. It's just over a month away from being back, and I can't wait. I'm sure you can't wait either. We'll get into the first thing we can talk about, which is a really interesting transfer link over the weekend. Fabrizio Romano mentioned that Newcastle had inquired about the future of Xavi Simons, the Dutch playmaker who is at PSG, started his career at Barcelona, one of Europe's hottest properties, and he showed that in the Euros in different parts, particularly with that superb goal he scored against England in the semi-final as well. So really interesting link this. The other clubs interested were very, very high on the agenda. You've got Bayern Munich in the case of Xavi Simons. You've got PSG still want to keep Xavi Simons as well. The thing that when I've done a little bit of chasing on his future generally, the suggestion is that he needs to be convinced by his future on where he'll play and what the next point of his development is. He will want European football, probably. That's why I think this one is a bit is a bit unlikely. I think it's very much like Michael Olise in the sense that it shows Newcastle's ambition, it shows their desire to push forward and make a statement rather than the possibility, the reality of Xavi Simons actually playing in black and white next season, because there are so many clubs in Europe who want him because of the way he is performed at the Euros, but also the way he performed at Leipzig last season as well, and previously at PSV. He signed for PSV Eindhoven and scored, I think, 19 goals in the Eredivisie, then went back for about €6 million on a buyback clause from PSG last summer, went out on loan to RB Leipzig and really hit the ground running there. Whatever happens to him next, he wants to play football. For me, and there's interest from Bayern Munich, there's interest from Leipzig as well, but I think if PSG really want to keep him, he sort of fits the bill for what they want to do. They want to get the best young players and under Luis Enrique and play them and get past this sort of Galactico style and sort of marketability thing that they had in the past. They really want to move past that, and Xavi Simons represents a potential world-class player who's yet to sort of break that. Still very mouldable, still very young, still very much with his future ahead of him. I think that's really what PSG want. So if they can convince him that he'll play there and that he can stay there, then they'll have a player on their hands. For Newcastle, if they can put a proposal forward, then that says a lot about where Newcastle are going, and we'll get into that in a minute. But I think for me, Xavi Simons is very much like Michael Olise in the fact that there may be an inquiry, there may be a hope and a dream, but I think this one is not likely to happen, so I wouldn't get too excited about it. On to the crux of this episode, and really, I think we've got to talk about Eddie Howe and got to talk about Newcastle's future and what happens after Amanda Staveley and Mehrdad Ghodoussi have left. Link to the video of my reaction to Staveley and Ghodoussi's departure in the description. That was a moment in the sand where we now have a different era, we now have a different direction. The Saudi PIF have taken a more hands-on approach. There's going to be a bigger connection between the club, between Darren Eales, Paul Mitchell as well, and the PIF, and we'll see how much Yasser Al-Rumayyan has to deal with on the day-to-day. Obviously he's the governor of PIF, he's got so many different businesses to oversee. I don't think he's going to be too heavily involved every day, but we'll see how much Darren Eales and Paul Mitchell really working together changes things, and particularly in relation to Eddie Howe, because one of the things that Dan Ashworth had a frustration with Eddie Howe was that he didn't get a very close relationship, because Eddie Howe has a very specific way of working with his inner circle, which basically amounts to his coaching staff, people he brought in with him, including Jason Tyndall, Stephen Purchase, that group of people, plus Graham Jones, who he inherited. That's his inner circle. He'll have to find a way of finding a connection with Paul Mitchell. I'm sure they'll have a working relationship. The club is pushing this idea of unity, but I think that Eddie Howe's going to have to work in a very different way than he's worked in the past, and that's going to have a knock-on effect to the sort of very, very high control that he's had at Newcastle and high control he's had of his team. I think that those days are numbered, and that's a question as to whether Eddie Howe will be comfortable working in that environment. The new voices, the new way of working, there'll be extra pressure as well. Last season was there was a lot of excuses given for injuries and excuses given for the size of the squad, and I think this season, with no European football, there's a hell of a lot that needs to be achieved by Eddie Howe if he is to keep away the sort of noises over his future. I just wonder whether the sort of new voices and that link with Paul Mitchell, who's incredibly hands-on as a sporting director himself, as I've sort of mentioned in the 2 videos I've done, with how much of an impact he's had on the academy, how much of an impact he's had particularly on recruitment, how that could work with Eddie Howe. And I do sort of think it's a very interesting dynamic that Eddie Howe no longer has his 2 biggest advocates in the Newcastle boardroom. Guendouzi and Staveley were the 2 people who built that front of house relationship that Eddie Howe enjoyed with the owners. That's no longer there. He didn't really have that with Dan Ashworth. He probably needs that with Paul Mitchell, but the way he works with his inner circle, that's not likely to happen. So it could be very interesting. There's obviously a lot of talk at the moment about England and Gareth Southgate's future being up in the air, and Eddie Howe being an obvious candidate for the England job. The FA will, I'm sure, want to speak to him or want to look at it and look at the possibility of working with Eddie Howe at some point in the future. It's definitely on his list to do, but I think that was previously down the line. He's going to be under pressure from the very, very start. There is no real margin for error anymore. The fact that Staveley and Guendouzi are no longer there really reflects that. The fact that Piff is taking a bigger slice of the pie, and the fact that Piff is taking a more proactive approach, means that perhaps the long-term approach to Eddie Howe's work can't really be there anymore. And I think it's very, very interesting. It's going to be very interesting to see if how Eddie Howe works alongside Paul Mitchell. There seems to be a very amicable start, but Paul Mitchell's also brought in James Bunce, his performance director. A really interesting podcast that James Bunce has spoken about, having a kind of marriage relationship with his manager, where they have arguments, but they have to have that sort of closeness. And I think, again, that's another person that Eddie Howe's got to open up and work with in his inner circle. And I don't think Eddie Howe is going to be able to have the sort of level of control and the level of demand and the demands of what he had in the last 2 years at Newcastle. He walked into the club as the first man through the door in terms of front of house. There was no sporting director. They had to get a manager in quickly because they were in serious relegation trouble at the time. And Eddie Howe has therefore worked quite high up with the board in terms of recruitment, in terms of getting the club in the shape that he wants it and to look the way he wants it. I think that was one of the frustrations that Dan Ashworth had with Newcastle. I think that's even more pertinent with Paul Mitchell because of the way he works alongside James Bunce on performance and recruitment and that sort of thing. It's very much in the realm of what Eddie Howe's been doing. So I'd be very, very intrigued to see how Eddie Howe gets on this season. And it's definitely the start of a new era. Newcastle have jetted off to Germany today for the next leg of their pre-season preparations. They'll be back to play Hull City at the end of the month. Then obviously there's the Sela Cup and Japan in there as well. But lots to get through before the start of the season. We'll also have plenty more transfer stuff to talk about. I hope you really enjoyed the chat with Steve Caldwell about Jonathan David last Thursday as well. I'll link that in the description too if you haven't seen it already. Really good chat with Steve. He gave a lot of great insight into Jonathan David and the way he would work, and I think he would be a very good sign for Newcastle. Plenty more rumours to get into on Thursday as well, and I'll see you then. Please like, share and subscribe. We are looking to get to 500 subscribers before the start of the season. Really think we can get there. Thanks very much, and I'll see you next time.